Good evening, everybody. I'm Alan Levine, and together with Tom Merrill, we run the Political Theory Institute, the sponsor of this evening's event. This is our last event of the fall semester, but stay tuned for the spring, where we'll have several other exciting events, including another event on Lincon with noted scholar Michael Zucker. But today, we are privileged to have Diana Schaub with us. She is a professor of political science at Loyola University in Maryland and a non-resident senior scholar in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Department at the American Enterprise Institute. She was the Garwood Teaching Fellow at Princeton University in 2011 through 2012, and a visiting professor in political theory at Harvard in the Department of Government in 2018, 2020, and 2022. She is the author of this handsome volume, His Greatest Speeches, How Lincoln Moved the Nation, a book on Montesquieu, and many scholarly articles in the field of political philosophy and American political thought. She's co-editor with Amy and Leon Cass of What So Proudly We Hail, The American Soul in Story, Speech, and Song. A member of the board of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, she also sits on the publication committee of national affairs. She earned her BA summa cum laude from Kenyon College and her MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. And she is noted in political theory circles for her lovely speaking, her beautiful turns of phrase, and evocative imagery. So we're all in for a treat today as Diana Schaub speaks on Lincoln's Lyceum address, Democratic Theory for Citizens. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Alan, for that lovely introduction. I am delighted to be here at American University. My subject this evening will be a very early speech by a very young Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln belonged to that first generation of Americans who came of age after the passing of the founding generation. Remember, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams had died hours apart on July 4th, 1826, the nation's golden jubilee of independence. Lincoln's speech centered on the ability of his generation to preserve that legacy. It was delivered in 1838 during a time of national conflict that would, within a quarter century, eventuate in civil war. Only 28 years old, but already in his second term in the Illinois House of Representatives, the young Whig politician had been invited to deliver a lecture to the Springfield Young Men's Lyceum. The theme he chose was the perpetuation of our political institutions. Presenting a frightening sketch of democratic dysfunction, Lincoln traced a rise in incivility and discord, tipping over into political violence. He showed how growing lawlessness, and worse, the toleration of lawlessness, eroded the people's trust in the government. Looking into the future, he predicted that disgust with an ineffectual government would provide an opening for demagogic populists across the political spectrum. Individuals of unbounded ambition would seize upon the disaffection to undermine the constitutional order. From small beginnings in disrespect for law, the entire experiment in self-government could be overturned. Having described the disease, Lincoln prescribed the cure: fidelity to the Constitution and laws. Democratic citizenship, according to Lincoln, does not permit disobedience of any kind. Even unjust laws must be religiously obeyed until they are repealed or reformed through constitutional channels, which include not only election, but the broad avenues of persuasion, those First Amendment rights of free speech, press, peaceable assembly, and petition. So this is a cure that's very easy to state, but not easy to instantiate. The course of antebellum events shows that Lincoln's speech did not bring his generation to worship at the altar of law-abidingness. If we listen more attentively, perhaps we can do better. With its warning against politically dangerous passions, the Lyceum address is timeless, speaking to our divided polity as much as to Lincoln's own. While the basic lines of his argument are, I think, quite clear, the details of the speech are complex, complex in their layering and challenging to many of our contemporary prejudices. We're not going to have time to delve into every aspect of the speech, so my plan is to select just a few passages to examine more closely. So let's start with the title. Always a good place to start when you're studying a Platonic dialogue, and that's just as true of Lincoln. So the perpetuation of our political institutions. Perpetuation is not just Lincoln's subject, but his aim. And as an aim, it might be thought to have a fairly conservative character. The task of Lincoln's post-founding generation, at least as presented early in the speech, is limited to what seems to be the modest task of keeping intact and passing along to the next generation our grand and lucky inheritance as Americans. Yet, at the same time, perpetuation breathes hope for the future. To perpetuate is to cause to endure indefinitely. In the very last line of the speech, Lincoln compares our political institutions, which he desires to perpetuate, to what he calls the only greater institution, by which he means the church, so rock solid in its foundations that, quote, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. The Bible verse that Lincoln quotes here is Matthew 16:18, where Jesus founds his church on the disciple Peter's faith in the revealed Messiah. Could a political founding rival the founding of Christianity? Is there a form of government proof against death? Lincoln does say that as a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. So this question of whether a free government can endure and what is required to make it endure preoccupied Lincoln from the start of his career. If the beginning is half of the whole, Lincoln's beginning promises much. In surveying the situation, he informs the Americans of 1838 that they are the legal inheritors of two fundamental blessings, basically the land and liberty. Lincoln foresees no difficulty in passing along this goodly land, unprofaned by the foot of an invader. However, serving as the caretaker of the political edifice is trickier, since the initial threat to it comes from an unavoidable source, time itself. Lincoln says it is our task to transmit the political edifice undecayed by the lapse of time and untorn by usurpation. In other words, time itself is a threat and an insidious one. As time elapses, we lapse, almost imperceptibly. Institutional decay, corruption set in. Now, the second threat, right, should be undecayed by the lapse of time and untorn by usurpation. That second threat, usurpation, sounds violent. But it's worth noting that the literal meaning of usurpation is to take possession of by use. In other words, new usages and practices can distort and overtake the original modes. Just to give an example, recent expansion of presidential power, right, by both Democratic and Republican presidents through the unopposed use of executive orders to do things that constitutionally should be done only by the legislative branch. I think on Lincoln's reading, that's a kind of usurpation. You're taking possession of something by use. So both of these dangers, the chronic one of time and then this more acute one of usurpation, arise from within. In other words, those are both forms of suicide, bringing about the self-destruction of self-government. After describing this double threat, time and usurpation, Lincoln turns to the contemporary evidence of system-wide breakdown. He focuses on two particular instances of mob action, and he calls them the most dangerous in example and revolting to humanity. Lincoln describes what happened in Mississippi, where a mob first targeted gamblers, then proceeded to lynch Black men, and then white men, supposed to be leagued with the Black men, and finally, random visitors from other states. He develops a lurid simile. Quote, dead men were seen literally dangling from the boughs of trees upon every roadside, and in numbers almost sufficient to rival the native Spanish moss of the country as a drapery of the forest. He then moves to a second horror-striking scene, which just so happens to be from another slave state, Missouri. Once again, Lincoln does all he can to shock his audience into feeling sympathy for the victim. Quote, a mulatto man by the name of McIntosh was seized in the street, dragged to the suburbs of the city, chained to a tree, and actually burned to death, all within a single hour from the time he had been a free man, attending to his own business, at peace with the world. At this point, Lincoln interjects a question that he attributes to his audience. But you are perhaps ready to ask, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? Now, this is a favorite rhetorical technique of Lincoln's. Through his placement of questions, he creates a dialogic engagement with his audience. Sometimes, as here, he puts the words directly in the mouth of an objector, a naysayer, thus allowing the likely grounds of resistance to be expressed and responded to. Other times, he'll pose the question himself as a way of advancing the argument or, helpfully signaling a new phase in the argument. So before this present question, he had already posed 5 others, and there are going to be 7 more questions that follow. So he's really making extensive use of this rhetorical technique of planting these questions. But this one is significant because it is the only one of the 13 questions to be ascribed to you, his listeners. But you are perhaps ready to ask, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? So why does Lincoln anticipate pushback at this point? When I just read those passages aloud to you, I saw people putting their heads down. I saw them shaking their heads. I saw them reacting with horror to the horror-striking scenes that Lincoln relayed. But Lincoln, so in other words, today we are properly horrified by the nation's history of lynchings. But Lincoln was addressing an audience that might have felt some sympathy with the lynch mob, or at least sympathy with the motives of the lynch mob, if not of the actions. So what were those motives? Before we jump to say racism, we need to look more closely at the actual incidents. And remember also that during these decades from 1830 until the Civil War, the majority of extrajudicial hangings were of whites. Lincoln's examples, however, were not of, cattle rustlers or horse thieves, who fell afoul of frontier justice. In the Mississippi case, the initial target was riverboat gamblers. Gambling had been recently legalized in the state of Mississippi. Despite that, many citizens, and those perhaps the most upstanding members of society, were morally opposed to gambling. And they were angry at the perceived injustice of the gamblers, as well as the perceived injustice of the new law that allowed gambling. Anger is a potent sign of the thirst for justice, a thirst powerful enough to send human beings outside the law, especially when the law is slow or unreliable or simply wrong. During this same time period, public opinion was greatly aroused against the new type of messianic abolitionists. Those abolitionists were intemperate in speech, and they were intolerant of political compromise. William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, had been founded in 1831, followed by the establishment in 1833 of the American Anti-Slavery Society. That society called for an immediate end to slavery and the annulment of the US Constitution, which the Garrisonians viewed as a pro-slavery compact. So, like the gamblers, radical abolitionists were engaged in a legal but extremely unpopular activity. This was the height of the abolitionist petition movement, which provoked the imposition of a gag rule in Congress and then an ensuing controversy over whether the gag rule violated the constitutional right to petition. Anti-abolitionist furor extended well beyond the slave states, and it was very strongly felt in Illinois. In 1837, the Illinois legislature had joined with other free states in passing resolutions condemning abolitionism. Significantly, Lincoln was one of only 6 of 101 Illinois legislators to vote against the resolutions. Moreover, he took the further step, a very bold step, of filing a protest against the Illinois anti-abolition resolutions. So, in selecting his examples of mob rule, Lincoln quite deliberately avoids the incident that was uppermost in the minds of his Illinois audience. That incident was the murder of the abolitionist Elijah Lovejoy. In 1837, Lovejoy had begun publishing an anti-slavery newspaper in Alton, Illinois, immediately after he had been driven out of St. Louis. So in other words, he tried to publish an abolitionist newspaper in a slave state. He was driven out of the slave state. He went across the river to Alton, Illinois, and it didn't go any better for him there. By November 1837, Lovejoy had been shot and his printing press hurled into the river. Lincoln is speaking in this Lyceum address just a few weeks after Lovejoy's murder. And yet Lincoln makes no reference to it. Makes a tiny one later on, but tells these incidents of mob rule that are happening. He doesn't mention the incident that had just happened in his state. He is avoiding triggering his audience. Now, his purpose is not, I think, to cater to their sensitivities, but rather by temporarily avoiding any mention of that specific incident, he is going to induce them to lift their sights higher to the larger matters that are at stake, and in fact, to help loosen the hold of their partisan passions, whether those passions were pro-Lovejoy or anti-Lovejoy, so that they can learn to reason together. Now, Lincoln knows how difficult it is to challenge popular passion directly. Those in the grip of anger, and even worse, if the anger is compounded by fear, they are disinclined to feel sympathy for others. They want sympathy for themselves. Aware of this resistance, Lincoln insists on giving it a voice. In other words, he's sort of modeling civil discourse for them. The you of his audience does not come right out and say, yeah, what's the big deal? Those gambling thugs got what they deserved. Instead, Lincoln has them say something defensive. What does this have to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? But still responsive to the larger topic, broader topic. And so they ask, well, what has this to do with the perpetuation of our political institutions? To prove that, quote, it has much to do with it, Lincoln first agrees, at least in part, with the objectors. He grants, yeah, those gamblers, they constitute a portion of population that is worse than useless. This is my feeling about gamblers too. Don't gamble. Lincoln goes so far as to imagine a pleasing scenario in which gamblers are, quote, annually swept from the stage of existence by the plague. Were nature to produce a morally discriminating virus, a sort of gambler-specific COVID. Lincoln says honest men would perhaps be much profited. by the operation. So in the short space of a few paragraphs, Lincoln has flipped the perspective. We move from a description of the Mississippi hangings as revolting to humanity to the thought that these deaths are, quote, never matter of reasonable regret. The reversal of perspective is even more shocking when Lincoln proceeds to retell the story of Mackintosh. Now we learn the rest of the story. Now we learn that Mackintosh was not just minding his own business. He had committed a heinous murder. Since Lincoln says he must have died by the sentence of the law, for him, quote, it was as well the way it was. Happened quickly. And Lincoln vouches, in fact, that this is, quote, the correct reasoning in regard to the burning of the Negro at St. Louis. Now he's not even a mulatto anymore. He's a Negro now. You might not realize it's the same story, but it is. So this sounds awfully hard-hearted. Lincoln first tried an all-out appeal to sympathy for the victims. A horror-striking scene, revolting to humanity. And then, aware of or anticipating the failure of that emotional appeal, he shifts to this very stark, callous reconsideration. Abstractly considered, he says, the direct consequences of mob rule are of little consequence. Direct consequences, the deaths of those particular individuals, of little consequence. Lincoln has intuited something important about his audience. Any approach that focuses only on the direct effects of mob rule is bound to be unproductive, since the wider public, some small part of which is acting as a mob, basically welcomes the outcome. Gamblers and murderers quickly dispensed. Lincoln disposes his audience to listen to him by validating their instinctive hostility to wrongdoers. Two things, however, should be noted. First, he renders their concern with justice less heatedly angry and more coolly calculative. And second, in the retelling of the events in Mississippi, he refers only to the gamblers at Vicksburg, saying nothing about the violence toward allegedly rebellious slaves and their supposed white allies. By leaving those racially charged lynchings out of his retelling, he says nothing, I think, to belittle those deaths or to modify his initial horrifying portrait. So, to the extent that his own convictions allow, Lincoln has befriended the vigilantes and the defenders of the vigilantes. This enables him to draw their attention to consequences, indirect, prospective consequences that may have escaped their notice. Lincoln, in other words, begins near the viewpoint of his listeners, rather than appealing altruistically to their concern for others, because that doesn't exist. He doesn't do that. Instead, he appeals to their self-interest, but in a way that demonstrates the linkage between their self-interest and the cause of law-abidingness. So accordingly, his first point is that the mob might make mistakes. The mob might hang some of its own. Mobocrats themselves are not safe from mobocracy. From there, he widens the circle of concern to the truly innocent who might be falsely targeted by the mob. He doesn't use boring language. He doesn't use legal language. He doesn't say due process. They've been denied due process of law. But this section of the speech does vindicate the careful, methodical, procedural component of our justice system. Once the rule of law is trodden down, the consequences are far-reaching. Lincoln's next point is that the vigilantes have released something that they did not anticipate. In their impatience, they skirted the law in pursuit of justice, justice as they understood it. Since popular opinion was in sympathy with their conception of justice, the perpetrators went unpunished. That corruption breeds another corruption. When those whom Lincoln calls the lawless in spirit, when they see that the law is not being enforced, they take that as an invitation to become lawless in practice. In other words, there's always those folks out there that are lawless in spirit, but they're kept in line through fear of the law. But now if the law is not being enforced, then the lawless in spirit become lawless in practice. So the vigilantes, right, they meant to crack down on crime. They were hanging gamblers. But Lincoln tells them what you've actually done, you've emboldened the criminals. When law is disregarded for the sake of justice, that provides license for those who would disregard law for selfish purposes of their own. Lincoln doesn't indicate how many people fall into this category of the lawless in spirit, who are normally kept in check by the fear of punishment. But he is emphatic that there are those who regard government as their deadliest bane and who will make a jubilee of the suspension of its operations. Not only does mob justice always carry this danger, but even some forms of legitimate protest, like those involving mass direct action, can spiral out of control. Civil unrest is always an occasion for the opportunistic looters and scammers, the lawless in spirit becoming lawless in practice. Meanwhile, social breakdown has a very different effect on the good citizens. When government proves ineffectual in controlling riot and crime, the tranquility-loving people lose trust in it. According to Lincoln, the alienation of their affections from the government is the worst effect of the mobocratic spirit. Political scientists, public intellectuals have tracked rising levels of cynicism, distrust, apathy among Americans ever since the turmoil-filled spent a lot of time in the 1800s, ever since the turmoil-filled 1960s and 70s. And I think their results echo Lincoln's conviction that the attachment of the people is the strongest bulwark of any government, and Lincoln says particularly of those constituted like ours. In other words, democratic government really does depend on the disposition of the demos. According to Lincoln, the end point of this erosion of confidence will be regime change. The really dangerous opportunists are not the petty criminals, but the tyrannically inclined. Lincoln warns against men of sufficient talent and ambition who will seize the opportunity and strike the blow against free institutions. And sadly, they will be aided by the decent folks who in troubled times look to a strong man for deliverance. We, the people, become willing to trade anarchic liberty for despotic security, or at least the demagogic promise of it. Without being classically schooled, Lincoln seems to have discovered the disintegrative trajectory of extreme democracy, a trajectory that was first diagnosed by Plato and Aristotle. He'd never read either one, by the way. All right, only after he traces these long-term consequences of Bob Rule does Lincoln allude very briefly to the recent killing of the abolitionist editor, Elijah Lovejoy. If his audience has been listening, they might now be inclined to react to current events with a little less knee-jerk fervor, whether it be pro-Lovejoy or anti-Lovejoy. Aware of the link between disregard for the law and the destruction of our political institutions, they will perhaps count themselves among those best citizens who can, because they foresee the danger, also act to avert the crisis. So, what then should they do? The answer, Lincoln says, is simple. Let every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity swear by the blood of the Revolution never to violate in the least particular the laws of the country and never to tolerate their violation by others. When I'm driving my car, if somebody litters and throws stuff out of their car, I stop and put it back in the car. Do not tolerate the violation of the law in the least particular. So Lincoln's solution is absolute law abidingness. I also don't jaywalk anymore. And really more than that, the oath to obey should flow from an underlying attitude or state of feeling. Democratic citizens should obey not out of fear, but out of reverence. Indeed, Lincoln calls for reverence for the Constitution and laws to become the political religion of the nation. Although it is logic that has revealed the imperative of law abidingness, Lincoln is aware that logic or reason alone will not secure the required obedience. Here again, he echoes Aristotle and the ancients. Lincoln highlights the role of habituation, even a kind of piety, in shaping a deferential attitude toward the law. So reverence depends on acculturation, hence the crucial role that Lincoln assigns to teachers and preachers, and most especially to mothers. Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Child rearing lessons from Abraham Lincoln. So it is the self-evident truths set forth in the Declaration of Independence that establish the binding character of consent-based law. However, by appropriating religious language for political purposes, Lincoln seeks to endow democratic theory with a sacred character. And so he says, let reverence for the laws become the political religion of the nation, and let the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the grave and the gay, of all sexes and tongues and colors and conditions, sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars. And yet, we might wonder whether there are not some exceptions to this first commandment of democratic life. According to Lincoln's list, the imperative applies to every American of whatever age, old or young, economic status, rich or poor, temperament, grave or gay, of whatever sex and whatever ethnic heritage, whatever tongue, whatever language you first spoke. And then he concludes with the two most interesting categories, those of all colors and conditions. Does the demand to revere the Constitution and laws apply to Blacks in America in 1838? Surely they are within the orbit of all colors. Does it then apply to those Black persons who found themselves in a condition of slavery, as well as to those in a condition of freedom? All colors and all conditions. And yet, how could it? Doesn't the natural right to liberty of an enslaved person invalidate the man-made law that establishes property in man? Aren't slaves within their right, their natural rights, to attempt escape? Aren't they even within their rights to murder their masters in their beds? Despite being counted in the census, population census, as 3/5 of a free person for the purpose of determining the number of a state's representatives, the slave population existed outside the bounds of consent. We know that slave masters taught a quietistic version of Christianity to their human chattels, emphasizing the biblical injunction, slaves, obey your masters. However, an American political religion sworn upon the blood of the Revolution could never demand or justify the obedience of enslaved persons. Thomas Jefferson was utterly frank on this point. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he pointed out that although slaves constituted one half the citizens of his state, they could not be expected to have any patriotic sentiment. Moreover, should they exercise their natural right of revolution, God would be on their side. So said Thomas Jefferson. The slaveholder Jefferson declared that, quote, the Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us, the slaveholders, in such a contest. Were there to be a slave insurrection, Jefferson is clear. God is on the side of the slaves. And everything that Lincoln ever wrote about the Declaration of Independence, and he wrote a fair bit about it, indicates that he subscribed to this idea of pre-political natural rights and its by any means necessary ethos. So his call for a political religion of law abidingness must have application to free citizens only. In effect, slaves remain in a state of war vis-a-vis their oppressors. But even this exemption for the tyrannized doesn't resolve all of the difficulties in combining respect for law with a creed that enshrines revolutionary resistance to violation of rights. What, for instance, is the obligation of the friends of the slaves among the citizens? How much must they sacrifice upon the altar of the law? Lincoln acknowledges the problem. Law at its best seeks justice, but it's never identical to justice. Moreover, sometimes law is used to establish and maintain injustice. What then? Here's what Lincoln says. When I so pressingly urge a strict observance of all the laws, let me not be understood as saying that there are no bad laws. I mean to say no such thing. Lincoln, I think, had more experience than we have of bad laws. Not only was slavery legal in half the states of the Union, but the entire nation was under a constitutional obligation to return fugitive slaves to bondage. In an 1855 letter to his slaveholding friend, Joshua Speed, Lincoln describes the terrible sight of slaves being, quote, hunted down and caught and carried back to their stripes and unrewarded toils. But, he says, I bite my lip and keep quiet. He warns Speed that Southerners should not be oblivious to the moral and emotional toll exacted by this duty. Quote, you ought rather to appreciate how much the great body of the Northern people do crucify their feelings in order to maintain their loyalty to the Constitution and the Union. Comparing obedience to the fugitive slave law to a crucifixion, Lincoln stresses the agony of compliance. The slaves are not the only sufferers. All individuals of conscience suffer under the slave system. In this one regard, at least, the Constitution required the sacrifice of one's moral and humane sentiments. Lincoln is delivering a very hard lesson in democratic theory. For citizens, he says, there is no option of, quote, civil disobedience. All disobedience is uncivil and destructive of civil government. Now, there is a right of revolution, but short of that exigency, there is only acknowledgement of the majority's legitimate power through their ballots to determine the motion of the body politic. It's not that the majority is always right. It frequently is not right. But the majority does have rightful authority. And that authority is itself grounded in the truth of natural equality and its logical corollary, government by consent. Okay, it's pretty grim, but Lincoln does offer a glimmer of hope and change. Lincoln points out that there is a democratic mechanism for addressing the problem of bad laws. Quote, bad laws, if they exist, should be repealed as soon as possible. Yet he immediately repeats the desideratum. Still, while they continue in force, for the sake of example, they should be religiously observed. Now, Martin Luther King Jr., influenced in part by the antinomianism of Henry David Thoreau and Thoreau's essay entitled Civil Disobedience, which was published in 1849. King, following Thoreau, argues that one can show respect for law and actually speed the repeal of bad law by means of a specific mode of law breaking. So in his letter from Birmingham jail, King declares, one who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit, King talking, I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law. Although Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. are often viewed as our nation's greatest moral lights, I think they fundamentally disagree on this foundational question of the nature of citizenship and the relationship between law and justice. Sorry. So I think there's probably no better exercise for every American than to read Lincoln's Lyceum address and King's Birmingham letter. Read them side by side and make a good faith effort to suspend your biases. I suspect that most of our bias is on the side of King. But I want to ask you to suspend that and really try to test the logic of these two positions. So for Lincoln, the choice is limited to the bullet or the ballot. Once you've agreed to be bound by ballots, you have to be bound by ballots going forward. Ballot is a kind of shorthand, not just for the elective franchise, but for the myriad tools of democratic persuasion: free speech, free press, rights of assembly, petition, access to the courts, including the very powerful tactic that is implicit within judicial review of testing local, state, and federal laws against the Constitution. We can talk more about this later, but there is in a way a kind of institutionalized, constitutionalized form of disobedience. But outright nullification, right, no matter how nonviolent, is impermissible. Whether it's Thoreau's minority of one, right, the person following his conscience and nullifying a law that he doesn't like, or John C. Calhoun's minority of South Carolina. South Carolina proclaimed a right of state interposition against federal laws that they regarded as unjust and discriminatory. So, in other words, from Lincoln's perspective, there is no logical difference between that radical abolitionist form of nullification and the heretical nullification of that South Carolina engaged in. Now, I do believe that there is very much to celebrate in King's legacy, but it still seems to me an open question whether his advocacy of, quote, civil disobedience has not, as Lincoln would have predicted, eroded respect for the rule of law. Could the 20th century struggle for civil rights have been conducted exclusively through constitutionally prescribed methods? In considering this, it is extraordinarily important to remember that no law breaking was involved in most of the techniques and activities of the movement. So the ingenious battle in the courts waged by the NAACP, the dangerous work of voter registration in the South, the Montgomery bus boycott, nothing illegal about that. Not required to ride a segregated bus. It's a boycott. It's an economic form of protest. Nothing illegal about it at all. The freedom rides, there's nothing illegal there. The federal travel, interstate travel had already been desegregated. The freedom riders, black and white, were putting that to the test at great physical risk to themselves. Similar heroic instances of nonviolent mass protest. Nothing law-breaking or illegal about most of the way in which the movement was conducted. So I guess what I would say sort of at the least is that one might say that the popularity of King's Birmingham jail essay has inflated the role of lawbreaking as distinct from other forms of protest in bringing about positive social change. In other words, it means we're all in a way sort of operating under a misimpression about how important that one particular technique of civil disobedience was, both in King's endeavors and then, of course, in the larger civil rights struggle as well. So one might also, maybe another kind of avenue of criticism here, one might also consider whether King's strictures on the allowable mode of lawbreaking, in other words, that has to be open, loving, and penalty accepting, whether that would have worked in Lincoln's day against, say, the fugitive slave law. That law was resisted through the Underground Railroad, but the Underground Railroad operated by necessity in secret. It was not open. And the aim there was not really the repeal of the law. I guess I would say the aim was really rescue and the spiriting to freedom of as many slaves as possible. Frederick Douglass, who was involved in the activities of the Underground Railroad, wrote an editorial in 1854 entitled, "Is it right and wise to kill a kidnapper?" in which he called for a more open, dramatic, and violent form of resistance, arguing that the slave hunting bloodhounds had forfeited their right to life by their assault on those who were pursuing their own right to liberty. And further, that since government was failing in its duty to protect the innocent, either the slave or his friends might act in his defense, meting out bloody death to those engaged in the, quote, infernal business. Similar arguments were made by some quarters in the wake of the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision. There were arguments made attempting to justify the targeted killing of abolitionists, of abortionists. Basically the same argument that Douglass was making for the targeted killing of federal marshals who tried to return slaves to slavery. Douglass's endorsement of violence, I think, should be a voice in this discussion. Douglass's argument is the precursor of Malcolm X's assertion that, quote, "when our people are being bitten by dogs, they are within their rights to kill those dogs." And in that statement, dogs is code for policemen who were at the other end of the leash of those attacking dogs. Malcolm X understood the Lockean logic. Legitimate government based on a free ballot binds the individual to obedience. Illegitimate government does not. The Lockean corrective to governmental abuse is revolution, or at least the potent threat of revolution. As Malcolm X put it, it'll be Molotov cocktails this month, hand grenades next month, and something else next month. It'll be ballots or it'll be bullets, it'll be liberty or it will be death. His incendiary language notwithstanding, he was careful to present this violence in the context of justifiable self-defense. Malcolm X, again, I don't mean to go out and get violent, but at the same time, you should never be nonviolent unless you run into some nonviolence. It is often said that Malcolm X was useful to the cause of racial justice because his extremism frightened white Americans into accepting reforms they otherwise wouldn't have. In other words, Malcolm played bad cop to Martin's good cop. But I think that's a kind of blithe historicist after the fact justification. And perhaps we should consider the possibility that elements of Malcolm X's radicalism were in fact superior on their own terms because they held true to the nation's foundations and were in the long run less dangerous. Malcolm X is simply not antinomian in the way that King is. As Lincoln argued in the Lyceum address, antinomianism, the position that acknowledges no authority beyond that of the individual conscience, that antinomianism threatens not just law and order, but more profoundly law and justice. While one might disagree, and I do disagree, with Malcolm X's assertion that Blacks in America were nothing more than victims of Americanism, his classic formulation of the issue In 1964, it's the ballot or the bullet. I think that accords with the understanding of John Locke, the American founders, and Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln gives his diagnosis of the present danger, and he prescribes the cure. One might expect that he would bring the speech to a conclusion. And you're probably wondering when I'm going to bring this speech to a conclusion. Just have a little bit more to do, so hang in there. So instead of wrapping things up, Lincoln poses another question, one that suggests his audience might be overly complacent about the future. Lincoln's planted naysayer now says, what is the supposed danger to our political institutions? Have we not preserved them for more than 50 years? In response, Lincoln undertakes a fascinating reconsideration of the founding generation. Back in the very, very beginning of the speech, second paragraph, Lincoln spoke about the hardy, brave, patriotic race of ancestors. But now, at the end of the speech, Lincoln reveals that the ancestors were composed of two distinct human types. You have the few and you got the many, right? Classic staple of ancient political philosophy. Again, seems like he'd read his Aristotle. And the few and the many were motivated by different passions, but equally questionable passions. On Lincoln's retelling, the success of the national experiment can be traced to some less than admirable traits. In 1776, what were the few interested in? They were avid for celebrity and fame and distinction. And what about the many? They were driven by deep-rooted principles of hate, the powerful motive of revenge directed against the British. So the time of the founding, the self-serving passions of both the few and the many were very happily, but coincidentally, mustered in service to the cause of civil and religious liberty. So he has subjected the passions of the few and the many to this very withering assessment. Why? Lincoln argues that these passions will not have the same good effect in the post-founding generations. What avenue will be available in the future to individuals with founding type aspirations? Lincoln insists, you got yourself an Alexander, a Caesar, a Napoleon. They just don't fit within the horizon of a Republican regime. Such figures, should they arise, and Lincoln believes they will, they would be republic destroyers. Further, Lincoln fears that the base passions of the ordinary folks, right, passions like envy and avarice, hatred, in the future, those passions will still be there, but they're not going to be directed against the British. They're going to be directed against fellow Americans. And Lincoln's conclusion is emphatic. Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will in future be our enemy. So, like the demand for reverential obedience, I think this anti-passion message is hard for us to hear. Every graduation speech, every self-help manual tells you, find your passion, live your passion. We're constantly celebrating passion. But our celebration of passion has a downside, especially for our politics. A passionate and impassioning politics is likely to be divisive, marked by hyperpartisanship, hate-filled invective, insufferable self-righteousness, and general nastiness. From the Lyceum address to the second inaugural, Lincoln rejects attempts to impassion political life. He avoids making visceral appeals to hatred and revenge. And so he does speak against slavery. He doesn't speak against slaveholders. He's skittish even about appeals to compassion, right? Because to be compassionate is to suffer along with the sufferer. But that quite naturally provokes anger in those who cause the suffering. So, as I say, Lincoln certainly composed very moving passages about the wrongfulness of slavery. But in general, he did not dwell on, he did not try to evoke the horrors of the institution in the way that the abolitionists routinely did. Lincoln always tried to lift the slavery debate to the level of principle and unimpassioned reason, avoiding the dangerous ground of compassion, anger, and blame. So the Lyceum address began by describing the task of the current generation as maintaining the political edifice of liberty and equal rights. Towards the end of the speech, Lincoln indicates that the props that once supported that edifice, those props are now decayed and crumbled away. Those old props were the passions of the few and the many during the revolutionary period. So Lincoln is forcing his audience to ask a really uncomfortable question. If the founders attempt to prove the capability of a people to govern themselves, if that depended on props, like the passions, then has the proposition really been proved? Lincoln implies that until reason presides over passion in the souls of ordinary Americans, the proposition remains unproven. The post-founding generation has a great unfinished task before them. It is a task that rivals and surpasses the task of founding. Each subsequent generation of Americans must give its own practical demonstration of the possibility of self-government. It might be worth remembering that the party to which the young Lincoln belonged, the Whigs, they favored a policy called internal improvements. And what that meant is they wanted to build canals and roads and improve the infrastructure, right, of the existing United States, rather than just expanding westward at a heedless pace. In the Lyceum address, what Lincoln does is call for a spiritualized and much more demanding version of internal improvements. His focus is on the quality of the American character. Self-government in the collective depends on the existence of self-governing individuals. Hence, Lincoln's call for general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular, a reverence for the Constitution and laws. So it turns out that there is no perpetuation without betterment, and there is no better guide to that betterment than Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you very much. It is our custom to take first questions from students. I will let you determine who a student is.
Which you learned at the University of Chicago,
I
as did I.
did.
Are you a student?
I am no longer a student here.
Oh, okay. Well, you're in a kind of in-between position then. We need a current student. Yeah.
Thank you very much for speaking. I was wondering, I think you touched on this at the beginning a little bit, but I feel like we can see some of the issues that Lincoln described, like mob rule or disillusionment with government, or like someone taking advantage of that disillusionment. And I was wondering if you think that that comparison is kind of fair to make, and also if you think that the solution of kind of replacing passion with mercy is still applicable to them.
Yes and yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it is perfectly relevant to our time. I mean, I think the speech is always relevant, but it is particularly relevant in these moments of high political divide, and then resort to kind of extremism. Yeah, mob rule. But it's helpful for us to remember. I mean, one of the things I'm trying to stress here is about rhetoric. So if you were worried about how sort of extremists on both sides are proceeding, how would you actually have a conversation with either one of those advocates? Lincoln shows us how to do that. And he's saying you have to, in a way, give something to what is motivating them. Not the looters and the scammers, but those who are really driven by some understanding of injustice, understanding of an injustice that has been done to their group or their part of America. You have to find that sort of sympathy. What part of that can you sympathize with? And you have to indicate that to them. So Lincoln says in the Temperance Address, he says that friendship is the great high road to reason. To a man's reason. Says you can have a just a rock solid logical argument, and it is not going to penetrate that person's brain. Compares it to a turtle's head. You can't take it. You can't pierce that turtle's head with a straw. Right? Your logic is just like a piece of straw. You have to take this route of friendship. And that's what I was trying to illustrate. You see Lincoln doing that in this speech. And it makes us a little uncomfortable, right? Why is he sympathizing with these people who are engaged in mob rule, with these lynchers? Why is he expressing some sympathy with them? But it's part of his political persuasion. We think speech is about self-expression. We're always expressing ourselves. Political speech is not about self-expression. It is about persuasion. And we can learn from Lincoln how to persuade. Now, I don't think, I mean, it's sad to admit, most of these speeches are not successful. So even though I think he discovered the kind of language that has some possibility of being persuasive, you know, it didn't avert the Civil War. So that's a sobering message. Are you a student? You are a student.
I'm a student.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. Sorry. Okay. I was curious. You made a distinction between, or you were describing how Lincoln makes a distinction between the ballot and the bullet,
Yeah.
and how Martin Luther King Jr. Advocates for a kind of civil disobedience, which in some cases is breaking the law. But how would either you or do you think that Lincoln would feel about civil disobedience that was not law breaking, in the sense of protest or criticizing the government, which both, although not breaking the law, do deviate from a kind of reverence to the Constitution?
Yeah, good, very good question. So yes, Lincoln believes that yes, showing reverence for the law does not mean you have to agree with the law, or that you're forbidden to criticize it. Lincoln himself is criticizing many things that have been done. He criticizes the Supreme Court decision, the Dred Scott decision. So he believes that yes, criticism and protest, the allowable modes of protest that I listed, right? You've got free speech, you've got free press, you've got a right of petition, right? You can petition the government. That is a right that we've allowed to sort of, I don't know, fritter away. People don't think of it anymore. We ought to be making more use of the right of petition, and the right of assembly. Right? So there are ways to assemble and make your dissatisfaction known. But it's very important. What is the right way to assemble? What does the First Amendment actually say? The right peaceably to assemble. It's the only one of the rights that has an adjectival qualifier. And I think we have to think seriously about what it means to do it peaceably. It doesn't just mean the way we talk about it now, like peaceful protest, but you're still spitting in the face of a policeman. That's still somehow peaceful. It's peaceably. In other words, it is a kind of statement about what is your actual internal disposition. And actually, that is one place where I think you could look to those protests from the 1960s to see what peaceably to assemble looks like. I mean, the incredible self-restraint shown by those protesters, a self-restraint that required them to overcome their natural instinct of either fight or flight. They had to overcome both of those. Yeah, we still have more students. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So you said that Lincoln said that we should follow both the Constitution and individual laws with religious fervor.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what the difference would be between that and only following the Constitution with religious fervor. Like, what about disobeying individual laws that aren't necessarily
good.
constitutional?
So it's the Constitution and laws, because you don't get to just pick and choose on the basis of your individual likes and dislikes which laws you think are constitutional and which you think are not constitutional. So it is both the Constitution and laws. Laws are made in fulfillment of the Constitution through the institutions of government established by the Constitution. Now, I did mention, though, that there is a kind of constitutionalized form of civil disobedience. So take Rosa Parks. Did Rosa Parks break any law? No, she did not. Because that municipal law was at odds with the Constitution. So there is a way, it's like, it's called bringing a test case, right? So she says, no, I'm not giving up my seat. She's arrested because there is a municipal law in the books. And that case works its way through the courts. And the courts say, no, that municipal law was null and void. It was always null and void because it was at odds with the Constitution. So that is a little opening, but it is a constitutionalized opening to test. And you can test municipal law, state law, federal law, right? Because it really is the Constitution that is primary. And so that's why Lincon is always saying Constitution and laws. Okay? So he's not just talking about, say, the laws of some despotic regime. You don't have to revere those laws. Right? It's because we live in a constitutional order that you have to obey both Constitution and laws. But as we learned, you can then figure out which of those, I mean, you can use your reason to figure out which of those laws are unjust, and then you can proceed through democratic mechanisms to try to repeal or change those laws.
So I have a little bit of a complicated question, but so you just talked about the idea of adhering to law, like very resolutely, very firmly, if you live in a democratic society. And that, of course, is completely reasonable. But in the case of people who were enslaved in Lincoln's time, those people don't have the meaningful avenues to actually petition or access any of their constitutional rights because they aren't even viewed as being people under the Union. So even though the United States is technically a democratic society for white people, it doesn't have that same extension of recognition for Indigenous people or for Black people within that framework. So how do you reconcile a requirement for adherence to law, but there's also an entire population of people who aren't recognized in those laws?
And that is what I was struggling with there when Lincoln says all colors and conditions. And I said, well, how could that be? I don't know whether whether I'm being true to Lincoln here or not, but it seemed, given everything else I know about him, his subscription to the ideals of the Declaration, I don't think he believes that the enslaved portion of the population is in any way obliged to the law. So in other words, he agrees with Jefferson that slaves are within their rights to try to escape, to try to kill their masters, to engage in a slave insurrection, if that's within the realm of prudential possibility, that he would have to grant all of that. But then you might say, well, all right, well, what then happens though later? What about the situation, say, in 1960, where the Constitution says Blacks, 14th and 15th Amendment, Blacks are citizens, have the right to vote, should have the right to vote, but it's not being enforced, right? So we are at odds there with our own constitutional order. So you can use the Constitution to try to change what was happening in the existing laws establishing segregation and so on. But then I think Malcolm X says, what really matters is that we have the ballot. And if we don't have the ballot, then we would be within our rights to use our right of revolution. If that is a sufficiently serious violation, then revolution could be justified or warranted. And Malcolm X doesn't actually engage in revolution, but he threatens it. And he says, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. You're the guys who say you believe in these principles. And so that's why he says it's going to be in 1964, it's going to be the ballot or the bullet. Either you make good on that promise of the ballot, or we are justified in resorting to bullets. And Malcolm X says there is no halfway house. This notion of breaking laws in some way that's civil, that's just an illogical halfway position. It's the ballot or the bullet. And that speech of Malcolm X's is really quite brilliant in the way that it uses this notion of the ballot or the bullet, and it's a speech you have to read very carefully. There's an evolving position there. There's an unfolding argument that he's making.
This is not as deep as some of the other questions, but I was just wondering, because this speech is supposed to be geared at young people, essentially, or people our age or even younger than us, what do you think or is there any historical context to how such addresses are received by the audience, like what kind of impact it has, and is it generally common for this level of depth and understanding of political institutions to be academically provided to young people at the time?
Yeah, there was a movement at this time called the Lyceum movement. And these institutions sprang up all over the United States. Small towns, right? Like Springfield, was a pretty small town at the time. The Young Men's Lyceum. It was a kind of continuing education program. So they weren't, I mean, I think they were mostly young men in their 20s and 30s. Remember, Lincoln really had no formal education. He didn't spend more than a year in a formal classroom. So he was very much in favor of this kind of enterprise. Yeah, I mean, the rest of your question, I don't know how to gauge its effects, but it was a very widespread movement. And, sometimes local figures like this up-and-comer, Abraham Lincoln would be asked to speak. But other times, well-known figures would be brought in. So Emerson spoke at the Springfield Lyceum. So this was a chance for, really important intellectuals, public intellectuals, to go out to the hinterlands. Yeah, so I suspect it had rather profound effects. There's been a recent attempt to revive the Lyceum movement. I think it started in some small town in Iowa. Right, to reestablish it. Yeah.
So with Lincoln's adherence to the sort of religious reverence of the Constitution, I'm kind of reminded a bit of Barry Goldwater and his sort of like how important he held the Constitution to be, and with that comparison, I'm also in mind of some of the groups that sort of supported him in his presidential election, including like the John Birch Society, times the Klan. And through that sort of alliance, this might not be a good question here. I am wondering that in the face of a ballot possibly being like, even though the ballot is a provided sort of a resource, I'm wondering, would Lincoln, with these sort of groups supporting sort of that adherence for their own nefarious purposes, does that in any way take away from the power of the ballot as a resource? Like, is that sort of, and if so,
Lincoln believes that a constitutional majority is the only true sovereign of a free people. Now, we know that constitutional majorities can be built that are wrong, that do wrong things. There is such a thing as majority tyranny. I don't want to comment on the specifics that you name, but you can see it clearly enough in Lincoln's day. So what are your options? When a constitutional majority, I mean, what Lincoln was worried about was that if slavery were allowed to spread into the territories, and if Stephen Douglas were successful in teaching Northerners the don't care policy, like, doesn't affect me, right? I'm not going to be a slave, so I'm indifferent. That if he were successful in changing public sentiment in that way, that what was coming down the pike was a second Dred Scott decision that would say, not only can slaveholders take their slaves into the federal territories, slaveholders can take their slaves into Illinois. Right? That he says we would wake up tomorrow and, you know, Illinois would no longer be a free state. And that could all happen constitutionally in a certain sense. I mean, even though he thinks the Dred Scott decision was wrong and unconstitutional, public opinion could take that form. Public sentiment could go in that direction. And that's why Lincoln says that in communities constituted like ours, public sentiment is everything. Law is just a kind of reflection of what the public sentiment at the time is that gets translated into law. So that the task is to inform and shape public sentiment. So that's what Lincoln sees himself as doing. But again, that just brings us back to, we've just got to rely on those democratic mechanisms. If you think the American electorate is going the wrong way, well, then you have to inform them differently. And to do that, you're going to have to speak persuasively to fellow citizens. So there's just no getting around it. Lincoln says the only other option, if you don't accept majority rule, right? Because majorities can be wrong. And so, well, let's do something else. He says, if you don't accept majority rule, guess what your other options are? Anarchy or despotism. That's it. Because if you don't accept majority rule, then you say, well, okay, then you're going to be governed by some minority. Why is that just? Even if it's a smart minority. A philosopher king.
You're opposed.
Yeah. Huh?
You're opposed.
So I'm seeing a lot of this is applicable today, like in the current moment, but what I was hearing was that to me, like one of the more contextually important aspects of this speech in particular is that, as you mentioned in the beginning, they're like the first generation growing up without the founders. They're very close to it still. So I'm wondering, like, now we're so far away from it. Like, does that matter with the perpetuating and the betterment, or like?
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Yeah, I don't quite know how to answer that one. I think it is still possible to get back to the founders, to recover the truths of the founders. And I don't think we actually have any hope if we don't do it, if we're not capable of doing it in a later generation. Whether it's harder for us now, I don't know. I mean, Lincoln was facing some real difficulties in getting back to the founders. I mean, think what he was facing. The Declaration says all men are created equal. And what is he encountering? He's encountering the Calhounites who are saying that's not a self-evident truth. That's a self-evident lie. All men are not created equal. Whites are superior to blacks. Okay? That's the Southern argument that has emerged. But what is Stephen Douglas saying and Tawney saying? They're saying, yeah, sure, all men are created equal, but the founders didn't mean black folks. They just meant, you know, all white descendants of British colonists are created equal. Blacks aren't included within that claim. So you had real assaults on the meaning of all men are created equal coming from different factions. And Lincoln is having to refute both of those understandings. And in fact, he believed that the Douglas Tawney slander was worse than the Calhoun position. Worse because more insidious. right? You say you still believe in the Declaration, but then you've written a whole bunch of people out of it. So Lincoln believed that the Declaration was universal and inclusive. At the time of the founding, all men are created equal meant all men, black and white, male and female.
I'm gonna go with just students because there's, I have a question.
Mentioned how Lincoln wants to kind of bring everybody to this place of reasoning and logic. I'm wondering how that's compatible with his also use of like persuasion and rhetoric and appealing to passion in his speech. Like, is it truly what Lincoln intended people only come to reason through this idea of persuasion?
Yeah. So, yeah, he certainly makes a very strong brief for reason, right? He says we can't have passion. It's got to be cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason. And so you're asking, well, how does that fit with maybe with all of that talk earlier in the speech about reverence? First, he said the solution was reverence. And then at the end, he says the solution is reason. Reverence, how do reverence and reason go together? Right? I think on the passion side, I think the answer is pretty clear because Lincoln, and in fact, many other people in the time period always use passion in the negative. So for them, passion really means the negative passions. Hatred, revenge, envy, right? Those that he lists. So they just never use passion to have a positive valence. But the question about reverence, I guess I would say something like it is I don't know, somehow it is for him, it is a kind of reason-based sentiment. It is reason that has caused him to realize the needfulness of reverence. And he then looks to habituation of the young in order to instill that. But I think he still believes that there comes a time when you are an adult, when you have to sort of think these things through for yourself. It helps if you've had a good upbringing, and so that you've been habituated to have a kind of reverence and law abidingness. But at a certain point, democratic citizens do have to understand the democratic theory. That may be an inadequate answer. Yeah.
This time, like the whole discussion of like civil disobedience versus kind of Lincoln's idea of reverence for law. How would you think like the draft kind of fits into this? Because I feel like Lincoln's ideal might necessarily pull back too much humanism there. Like say Thoreau actually got drafted into the Mexican American War. I think that was it. Like would Lincoln kind of say like you need to still hold that reverence or else you fall into despotism and anarchy, or is there almost like
Yeah, I mean that's a good test case perhaps, because there the state is making a very big claim, right, on your person, asking you to risk life. So I think his answer would be the same. I mean, he was opposed to the Mexican American War. That was not a war fought with the draft, but say there had been a draft. I think he would argue that citizens are obliged to answer that call, even if they believe the particular war is unjust. They still have the avenue of trying to convince their fellow Americans that it is unjust, that we should desist from that engagement. But until they can do that, you are bound by the will of the majority. But you see how how serious it is then. Yeah, what's really at stake? Yeah.
So I think several times now you've kind of confirmed that it's fair to say that he's trying to reassure a lover of justice the rule of law is for their benefit, not for the benefit of the unjust. He's not even that concerned about the, too hastily murdered. It's a problem, but it's like the least of the three
Yeah.
reasons, right? So what he's trying to persuade them of is that the instant gratification of justice now, justice, bad rules be damned, is not ultimately worth the undermining of the framework that allows justice to obtain, right? So, and he's doing this using reason, and sort of along the lines of this passion inquiry. I'm wondering, by the time you get to his language about how preserving the republic may be an even greater task, isn't it fair to say that he's reattaching maybe a kind of ambition, or that he's trying to persuade maybe the few, if not the many, to really love that cause and channel their ambition there?
Yeah, that's right. So in other words, in the Lyceum address, it looks as if ambition in the future is just going to be dangerous, right? Especially the super ambitious types. If you can't found the republic, you have to destroy the republic. Be Caesar, right? But I think you've picked up on is that there is another option, and he is talking to ambitious young people, and he himself is an ambitious young person. And so there is piety towards the founding, there is reverence, right, for the Constitution and laws, but by in a way arguing that the task of succeeding generations is greater, harder, right? That is an invitation to the young. Here is the task that it belongs to you to do. And you achieve it not by destroying the republic. You achieve advancement and progress and improvement through fidelity to the past. He has put together. This is why Lincoln is both just like the perfect liberal and the perfect conservative, and they in fact belong together. It's through that fidelity to the past, by faithfulness to republicanism, that you have the option of saving the republic. Right? And it is Lincoln who saves the republic. Think of the lines at the Lincoln Memorial. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. He can outshine George Washington, but through fidelity to the founding. So let's just one word on this. I do not like calling Lincoln a refounder. I don't think that's what he is, because I believe he is faithful to the original founding. He brings us back to the original truths, but he does so at a deeper level, at a more internalized level, at a more spiritual level. So it does represent a kind of fundamental leap forward, but not in the sense of a refounding.
We're getting low on time. I think we have time for one more question. I'm gonna.
Well, anybody who's going to be, aren't we going somewhere?
Yeah, well,
I will see
okay.
you later. I do not want to know your question.
Okay, all right. So that,
Right here.
yeah, we'll say, I see two more hands then. So you and
Yeah, I guess I see a big similarity between how Lincoln conceives of the democratic citizenship and how Washington does.
Yeah.
And that, like, one question I've always had about like Washington's farewell address is he makes this point about like how citizens should like avoid the spirit of the party, and like instead turn to like a similar reason that like Lincoln's advocating for. But I guess you see like Madison, the Federalist Papers, talk about like how like factionalism is like rooted in human nature. So then like the solution is to like create a system of governance that's like meant to like deal with like this inevitable fact of human nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess my point is like, I don't know if like Lincoln and Washington, or it just seems like Lincoln and Washington's like form of citizenship is like fighting against human nature. And I don't know if like what like necessarily the route is to like cultivating this kind of like democratic citizenship. And like you mentioned that like
Lincoln's not reading Plato and Aristotle, so like the many are not reading it either. Like, I don't know, so like, do you think like Lincoln like thinks this form of citizenship is like even possible, or like what is, I guess, sort of like the route to like forming democratic citizens who like use their use of reason over the passions?
Yeah, but really good question. So I think that Lincoln subscribes to all of the, ingenious discoveries and mechanisms of the new science of politics. So, everything in the Federalist Papers, he's signed on with. He understands how the Constitution, pits ambition against ambition and so on. And he thinks all of that is good. But I do think he doesn't think it's enough. And so the character of the people really matters. And you're right that there, I think his affinity is with George Washington. And so Washington in the farewell address, this language of political religion of reverence is not totally new or unique to Lincoln. It's in the farewell address. When Washington spells out the meaning of democratic government, he gives the same democratic theory. He says the law is sacredly obligatory. He uses that word, sacredly obligatory, right, upon all citizens, unless or until it's changed. So I think that Lincoln, he definitely, as a youngster, he had Weems's Life of Washington. He really studied Washington. He knew the farewell address backwards and forwards. I think he's very influenced by it. And you could also, point to in the farewell address where Washington talks about the need for a religious people, and the way that would support democratic government. So I think that, Washington is, or Lincoln is picking up some of that. So but then on your question of human nature, is this, I don't know, an impossible task because of what you're confronting in human nature? I think Lincoln is a realist about human nature. One of the ways you see that is in the Lyceum address, where he says, these people of super ambition, they are going to continue to arise. Human nature is not going to change. Right? Lincoln says repeatedly in speech after speech, we've got to take human nature as we find it. Right? It's there. But he thinks that in addition to these more questionable aspects of human nature, there are these higher and loftier aspects of human nature. And so he's always appealing to that, the better angels of our nature. And the better angels of our nature inform us more, guide us more. And he, despite the lack of success of most of these speeches, he doesn't give up. It's all we've got. If you're going to stick with republicanism, then you're just going to have to keep trying.
Final question. So Lincoln in the Lyceum address condemns what he calls outrages of mobs committed against the law. I wanted to ask you a specific thing about the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. This was an act that encouraged a kind of lawlessness in that federal marshals and commissioners could assemble a posse comitatus. And these were mobs which often acted lawlessly with the nominal authorization of the law. They in 1852 captured Thomas Sims and his wife, Mary Sims. They were free people who were enslaved. In 1854, they captured Anthony Burns, a free person, and enslaved him. And that mob then killed a federal marshal.
Right.
So my question is, Lincoln doubled down on this, and Douglas faulted him for it. He said this is not an act which is authorized by the Constitution. But Lincoln continuously said he supported this law, which encouraged lawlessness.
Well, good question. Mostly he didn't say much about the fugitive slave law. So for instance, he was out of politics when the law was passed in 1850. That was not what re-energized him to get back into politics. It is the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act that brings him back into politics, that really makes him worry. At the same time, I think Lincoln understood the deficiencies of that law, some of the questionable elements of the law. He believed that there was a constitutional obligation to have a fugitive slave law because he believed that there was a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. And it is part of obedience to the Constitution to give effect to any clearly stated requirement in the Constitution. So he thought there had to be a fugitive slave law. But as I say, as to the specifics of the law, I think he does indicate that he has some quarrels with it. He does that in the first inaugural. So in the first inaugural, which Frederick Douglass, by the way, thought was just a speech of appeasement, but I don't think he read it carefully enough, because what Lincoln says in the first inaugural is that, yes, this administration will enforce the fugitive slave law, but then he also says that maybe it should be revisited to look at whether there are not, he says, so that the law would not cause free persons to be taken into slavery. So he is very aware of the deficiencies, the injustices implicit in the law, in that particular version of a fugitive slave law. And he does suggest returning to it and taking a look at it. The other thing he says in the first inaugural is, and by the way, while we're enforcing that fugitive slave clause, which we are obliged to do, how about enforcing the Privileges and Immunities Clause? He knew that the Privileges and Immunities Clause, Herbert Storing says this, was the way by which Northern freedom cut into the South, right? Southern postmasters were refusing to deliver abolitionist literature. Black sailors were not allowed to come into port in Charleston Harbor. All of those things are violations of privileges and immunities. So Lincoln is trying to hold that constitutional balance. So he's saying, yes, I have an obligation to enforce the fugitive slave law, but we also have an obligation to give effect to the Privileges and Immunities Clause. But as to Kansas, Nebraska, in that letter to Speed, he says he actually says, he seems to say it's not a law. Kansas-Nebraska Act was conceived in violence. 4 things he says: conceived in violence, being carried out in violence. I mean, it's just one form of violence after another, is how he views Kansas-Nebraska. So I don't know what that might have. I mean, would that authorize the kind of action that Frederick Douglass was prepared to take with respect to Kansas, Nebraska?
Well, please join me in